Hey, what's up, CM? Welcome back to another week of CM Online or CM at home or maybe CM at a coffee shop, whatever the case may be. We're just stoked that you would be watching with us here online. Look, I'm going to say this right out the gate so that everybody understands exactly where we're coming from. We know it has been 7 months since we have been together physically, able to worship, gather, learn, and fellowship together. And let's be honest, that is tough. It's tough to deal with. It is hard to wait so long. But I want to encourage all of us. One, you're not alone. All of us feel it. All of us feel the frustration, the impatience, the fear, and all of the other emotions that are wrapped up in the unknown and wanting to get to a destination that we're just not sure when that target date is going to stop being moved on us, right? We're all together. But two, here's what I want to encourage you. It will be sweet when we get together. And when I say sweet, I mean like the taste of fresh honey, as we hear often in Scripture, right? It will be sweet to the soul to be able to gather again, to be able to worship together, to learn together, and to fellowship together. This too shall pass. We will be there in God's time. Sometimes His time is in our time. And our prayer is that as we return to this word we've all learned to hate, normal, that it wouldn't be a return to what was, but a return to better days ahead that God has for us. So we are choosing to believe the best is yet to come. So I want to encourage you to take that approach as we continue to navigate this season and choose to grow through what we go through. That's why we've called this series The Waiting Room. We don't know when it's going to end. We don't know when our number will be called so that we can go back and be seen, right? We're still in the waiting room, but we are learning together, virtually, to grow through what we go through. And maybe some of you have taken advantage of opportunities just to get together on a personal level with some other folks to watch and have conversation. I hope that that's been available to you and that we would continue to have those opportunities presented to us en route to gathering yet again in person to worship at CM. But this week, we're going to look at a story in the Bible that many of us sort of know, the macro picture, the macro narrative of the story, but maybe a specific one that we don't know. And that is a story about a dozen spies, which of course is exactly what you were thinking, right? As we look to grow through what we go through, we want to look at a story of espionage. Well, we say spies because that's how it kind of reads in our Old Testament translation in the book of Numbers, chapter 14 that we are in this week. But really, what we're looking at is a reconnaissance mission. 12 spies go out, 12 come back, 10 have one way of looking at things, and 2 have a different way of looking at things. You know what's funny about Numbers, this book of Numbers? A lot of us, when we scroll through our Old Testament, we crack open the Word of God and we start looking maybe to read in certain sections. The book of Numbers doesn't reach out and grab us. If we're being really honest, the book of Numbers sounds quite boring. Why would I want to read that? But here's something funny about the book of Numbers that you may not have known. That in its original language, in the Hebrew tradition, the book of Numbers actually would have been read as in the wilderness. Meaning, back thousands of years ago, if you were reading of this story in the Old Testament, instead of reading the book of Numbers, you would have read the account of in the wilderness. Now that probably reaches out and grabs you a little bit, especially in a year like 2020, right? We know. Because most of us feel like we are in the wilderness. That's how we tend to feel in this season together. But I want to read a story about a few spies who have gone out to recon and essentially collect information, terrain data, vegetation data, personnel data, all sorts of information in kind of a reconnaissance mission into what is called the Promised Land. To remind you, the Old Testament is essentially a story of God's faithfulness to his people, even in light of their lack of faith and obedience and trust in him. He was always trustworthy, even when they were weak. And so what we have is a story of God's people who were taken captive. We know this in the book of Exodus. Maybe you've heard the story of Moses. Maybe it was flannel graphed for you in Sunday school growing up. Maybe you've seen Mo in the big exit shout out to VeggieTales, or maybe your parents or your grandparents maybe watched that old Charlton Heston movie, The 10 Commandments, right? And we're all familiar, most of us at least, with the story of Moses, where he goes to Pharaoh and he says, listen, God is saying, let my people go. The people of Israel were enslaved. They were taken captive under Egyptian rule, under the Pharaoh. We know the story of the plagues and the miracles and what happened. He hardened Pharaoh's heart, then he softened it. He let the people go. He hardened it again. They went after the people. God separated the sea through Moses in this miracle. He made a way where there was no way. They walked through it together, then posted up at Mount Sinai. God sent some instructions for living to them. They spent about a year there building up pop-up church. We call it the Tabernacle there in kind of this mountainous area. At the base of Mount Sinai, they posted up their tribes so that they could stay centered in communion with God. And then God says, now it's time to take this 300-mile journey to the promised land. This land that I've given you, this new geographical area flowing with, as it says, milk and honey, rich with blessings. I'm going to give this new area to my people. We call it the Promised Land. Did you know that it should have been about a 30-day journey? Looking at all measures and standards by way of travel arrangements at that time, for that amount of distance and that space with that amount of people through that terrain, most believe it would have been about a 30-day journey. Do you know it would have ended up taking them 38 years? See, the Israelites found a way through their lack of faith, stubbornness, and native language almost of negativity to take a 30-day journey and turn it into 38 years. Why? Because they adopted a posture of negativity and complaining instead of an attitude of gratitude and hope. And we see this in a story in Numbers 14. As some spies return, this is what it says. Then the whole community began weeping aloud, and they cried all night. Their voices rose in a great chorus in protest against Moses and Aaron. Moses was their leader, and then Aaron, obviously, in relation to him. What was odd is that Aaron and his family had a few chapters prior started publicly protesting against Moses too, saying, what are you doing? You're leading us through this crazy wilderness. What is going on? And so now these more people have started to come together and try to rise up against Moses and Aaron. It says, if only we had died in Egypt. They're saying, why couldn't we have just died back then when we were slaves to Egypt? Or even here in the wilderness, why couldn't we have fallen down, hit our head, or maybe gotten bit by a snake or eaten by an animal, right? I mean, they're literally talking about, we wish we would have died either in Egypt or in the wilderness. It says they continued to complain, why is the Lord taking us to this country just to have us die in battle? Our wives and our little ones will be carried off as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to just go back to Egypt? And they plotted amongst themselves. They said, let's choose a new leader and go back to Egypt. And then Moses and Aaron, they fell on their faces. They were so in desperation on the ground before the whole community. And two of the men spoke up, two of these spies, Joshua and Caleb. You'll know Joshua. He writes a book a little later on in the Old Testament of the Bible. They spoke up and they tore their clothing and they said, listen, people of Israel, the land we traveled through, we explored it. It is a wonderful land. And if the Lord is pleased with us, he will bring us safely to it. It is rich. It is flowing with milk and honey. Do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people in the land. They are only helpless prey to us. They have no protection, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. Do you know what happened in this story? They seek out what will be a land promised to them, and a dozen reconnaissance-minded, missioned men go out, and they seek, and they see individuals walking amongst this land, and they see fear. They don't see through faith. They have fear goggles on. They don't have faith goggles on. So they come back, and 10 out of the 12, you know what they do? They come back and they say, no way. We'll be destroyed in battle. We will be completely decimated. Our families will be taken as plunder. This is a bad idea. But 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, come back and they say, no. God is with us. Don't be afraid of them. Don't forget what God did. He parted the Red Sea. He delivered us out of Egypt. He has brought us here. He has promised us this land. He hung the moon and the stars, and the very God who did that has the ability, the power to deliver this land to us. So do not be afraid. See, here's where most of us get to in seasons in the wilderness of life. Things get difficult. We go, we look ahead, we try to kind of take the temperature of culture, we try to look into the future and see what's on the horizon. And a lot of us end up speaking out through frustration instead of faith. We end up griping instead of growing. We end up complaining instead of contributing. Why? Because fear reveals what our faith is really in. Fear looks into the unknown and says, no way. Faith looks into the unknown and says, God will make a way. That is the difference between walking in circles or moving forward. So for all of us this week, the word is a challenging word from 2 recon men in the Old Testament, in Numbers, or in the wilderness, chapter 14. What is that word? Are we griping or are we growing? Are we complaining or are we contributing? Are we voicing our frustrations and our fears, or are we voicing our faith? What should we do when we see wrong? Instead of complaining, why don't we contribute? Why don't we live on the solution side? In a season like this where it seems that everybody on the internet is mad about everything on the internet and seems to not treat each other kindly on the internet, why don't you be positive on the internet and contribute in a God-honoring way? Why don't you lift out or lift up and reach out to people to help them? Why don't, instead of us taking a posture of fear and wondering what will happen, why don't we beg God to give us the faith and the strength to take a posture of hope, that we would look ahead and trust that God can do what only God can do. And when God is with us, as He is His church, He will lead His church into the land where He wants them to go. Are you willing to walk by faith in the direction of God's best, or continue roaming in the circles of complaints, negativity, fear, and frustration? It's a challenging word for all of us. I would argue that as I preach this, even though I stare into the lens of a camera, I could easily be staring into the face of a mirror. Why? Because this is a word for all of us. My prayer is that it is helpful, that we would learn to take the proper posture in order to grow through what we would go through. As always, we love you guys. We are praying for you. If there is anything specific we can ever pray for, continue to DM us, as many of you have in this season. We consider it a joy and a privilege to have the opportunity to lift you up in prayer. Continue to pray for God's direction for CM as we continue to navigate this journey to regathering together yet again in person. As always, we love you guys. Have a great week.